It was the year of 1812. Russia would win the Turkish War, gaining the eastern portion of Moldavia. Britain, looking to stabilize the Balkan region before Napoleon's invasion of Russia, would mediate the treaty between Russia and Turkey. After the Russo-Turkish War, Russian soldiers would be redeployed westward in order to confront the threat of France invading. Troops would redeploy by marching towards the Western Front, and as any old trek, it would be very long and very hard. Food would be scarce. Soldiers would have to drink from tainted water sources such as rivers, causing dysentery, diarrhea, and other illnesses such as typhus, and a mysterious illness that was deemed to be very, very similar to the Black Death. As soldiers who caught this disease would develop buboes all over their body alongside a high fever. But of course, no one knew at the time that that disease would soon be the war that would be the end of all wars as we know it. The returning Russian soldiers would act as the patient zero for the new unknown disease and would integrate themselves back into the Russian army without any further complication. With news of a mysterious illness breaking out amongst Russian soldiers, coupled with a case of Black Death spreading amongst the city of Istanbul in Turkey 1 month prior, Russian doctors assumed that this illness was the re-emergence of the Black Death. The Black Death was a bubonic plague that wiped out a third of the European population back in the 1300s. It was carried by vectors such as rats and lice, and it would cause pus-loaded buboes to form all over a victim's body and eventually cause, total organ failure and stuff. Super hardcore metal shit. But this was not the time for worrying about diseases. This was a time for war, as Napoleon's forces would soon invade Russia. Earlier, France set up the Continental System, which blockaded merchants from trading with the United Kingdom. The Russian Empire, however, openly refused to follow this blockade, causing the infuriated France to order Napoleon's army to begin their descent into Russian territory. The French forces would capture the fortress Vilnius, sieging Riga on their way to the heart of Russia. But when they entered the city of Moscow, the city was quiet. The streets were abandoned, as they seemed to be devoid of all life. The French raiders fell for it. The entire city would be engulfed in a blaze of flame, as ordered by a Russian general. Setting Moscow ablaze was a very crazy last-ditch attempt at repelling the Grand Army, killing thousands of soldiers on both sides. But what both the French and the Russian soldiers would never expect is the burnt corpses of Russian soldiers reanimating and running at both the warring nations, clawing and biting. Napoleon ordered an immediate retreat from the Grand Army, with retaliating undead giving chase. As the French would cross the Berezina River, however, a trigger-happy Frenchman would blow up the bridge connecting the river, leaving portion of the army trapped on the other side of the peninsula to fend for themselves, as hordes of cannibals would slowly descend upon the encampment. This marks the first encounter with the war that would end all wars. The war against a mysterious, unknown illness, nicknamed by only the Catholic Church as the Blight. The Blight is a zombie virus, essentially. The infection would course through the body, tainting an infected individual with what would be called impure thoughts and desires. And no, we are not talking about the desire to make love to your horse after a hard day's work in the field. No. We are talking impurity such as cannibalism, arson, suicide bombing, and rape. But cannibalism, I guess. The Blight infection process has 3 stages, from its initial infection to late-stage symptoms and the all-inevitable reason why I'm making this video in the first place. Stage 1 symbolizes the first week of infection. It is the period where victims have enough white blood cells to appropriately fight off the disease. Other than very minimal environmental storytelling from some in-game quarantine zones, it is very hard to pinpoint exactly how quickly the Blight takes over its host. But if I may judge how ridiculously aggressive the pathogen is based on player infection, I would assume that the infection is very quick, taking only about a Fortnite. To transform a guy who got bit by a rat into a guy who bites rats himself. From what I could speculate from my observations in regards to the blight, its earliest symptoms consist of bodily responses such as from the body trying to dispose of the disease. It's the most common symptom of any disease, but the frequent discharge of chest fluids causes massive damage to the lungs and throat. The process in which the body runs low on red blood cells to properly fuel the human body. This causes both fatigue and the skin turning pale, which is very common with zombie diseases. Perhaps lore-wisely, older zombies would have much whiter skin compared to the newly infected zombies due to battle wounds and internal scarring from the violent disease annihilating them from the inside. Most commonly associated with the body fighting off a disease. The body chooses to burn the disease away by increasing its own temperature, causing immense discomfort in its victim. The blight was initially misdiagnosed as the return of the Black Death. There is no physical visual evidence of the infected having these puss pockets, nor are they ever displayed in the official art, but I assume that development are so keen on adding cysts to infected NPCs and would rather add a Georgian grenade launcher instead. Stage 2 displays the body's inability to fight off the virus anymore. With white blood cells running low, the disease is allowed to do whatever it wants to the human body. Patients would begin to slowly start rotting as the later stages of infection were to take place, starting with more vibrant symptoms such as perhaps it's the disease trying its darnest to try and hijack the victim's musculonervous system. It's mostly shamblers who would raise from graves in quarantine zones. Given that they are slow, they must have obviously been victims of the initial plague and were reanimated after their passing. Shamblers are unable to run, and this may be due to damage to the musculonervous system, in which the paralysis comes from, as the transformation was improper because the body originally put up a fight against the disease. I'll talk about this bizarre theory later. The infection of the brain could mess with the hippopotamus gland and numerous other parts of the brain, which can cause severely antisocial behavior in victims such as paranoia, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and on top of all those mental stuff, crippling headache. Infected body tissues lose their blood supply, effectively killing off parts of the human body. But this is not the reason why some zombies have holes in their bodies and the fact that they have their limbs missing. Those are just combat wounds. I'm just adding necrosis to the list because this sounds cool. To prevent spread of infection, the infected will be quarantined and consequently buried in quick mass graves, mainly with headstones as a last-ditch spiritual intervention to prevent resurrection of the corpse, as ancient traditions claim, proven to be futile, as the final symptom of the infection occurs a brief moment after the patient has perished. Stage 3 of infection occurs, which displays the plague's total control of the victim's body. Having killed off the brain, the disease apparently manages to hijack brain tissue to send signals along the nervous system, creating an effective undead reanimation, using the victim's corpse's musculonervous system as a vector for disease transmission. The zombies raised from the dead, in case you forgot. But it also seems like despite the blight being a zombie virus, it managed to retain a victim's demons whilst destroying every other part of their miserable psychology. The neuromuscular system is the connection between the nerves and the muscles. The brain sends signals through the nervous system that is linked to the muscles. In turn, the muscles expand and contract, allowing free-range movement, both before and after death, which is the most understandable and logical explanation as to how a human can raise from the dead with the pure and unrelenting intent to bite people for no reason. But what seems to confuse me in this theory is the fact that if the zombies would be controlled through their nervous system, then they would be too stupid to be able to pick up a gunpowder barrel, set its fuse on fire, and run towards a group of unsuspecting soldiers. The disease also manages to possess some form of intelligence, managing to pinpoint exactly when it's the most appropriate time to resurrect recently deceased corpses. An example of this is during the campaign in Leipzig. There is a graveyard which acts as a spawn point for the undead. Given that the zombies emerging from these graves are fresh, the Leipzig graveyard may have been a mass grave to dump infected corpses in, because nerve death occurs a while after death, making reanimation impossible. And that's my second question. Well, what would be considered a true zombie death? Sure, players slay hundreds of infected through their gameplays, but wouldn't the zombies resurrect once again? What's the limit to this resurrection? Canonically, zombies are immune to pain, fire, stab wounds, and pitchforks. But they perish with just a slice of a blade? Or are the blades just really sharp? How am I psychoanalyzing this game too hard? My theory to the Blight is despite it being a disease, it's also some sort of manifestation of the Antichrist. I mean, the Blight takes over a human and amplifies their sins and rotten desires. It's almost like it's similar to the Cross virus from the comic series, Crossed, but without the donkey. Now, I prove this from the fact that the Blight can be cured via Catholic intervention by a religious industry professional. Scientifically, there is something linked to faith that makes the infection obsolete. Why? Does this mean I can't solve this through atheist japping? No, but that's my strong suit. I don't even know anything about Catholicism other than the fact that it's Protestantism, but cooler. I can't explain the religious talk relating to the Lord of the Blight. I'm an atheist. I know. Except, of course, it's the concept of sin, greed, lust, envy, wrath, gluttony, sloth, pride, the 7 deadly sins, the separation from God, good. For sin is the blight leading to a human causing destruction within his or her village. Churches would hold weekly sermons, reminding folks to retain their purities and abstain from sin, but humans keep forgetting. They keep sinning. But this practice of Catholicism would serve as the last remaining bastion of humanity, as long as a victim would have the humanity not to succumb to their barbaric instincts. The Blight virus would be unable to take hold of their soul. Therefore, a true Catholic wouldn't turn. But no matter how hard you pray to God, He is not going to save you from having your jugular torn out from your throat by a runner. Perhaps what split the real-life historical timeline away from the Guts and Blackpowder timeline was the intervention from God. In this timeline, the Tribulation happened. The Tribulation is what happens to the sinners left behind after the rapture, predicted by Jesus himself. In this case, intense holy judgment is placed on the soldiers and citizens of warring Europe, so God can observe if they were worthy of the gift of life. And citizens would act accordingly, desperately smearing blood on their doorways in order to be spared by the wrathful God, which was like Bible stuff. I don't exactly know where it was from. It was something about Moses. As chaos emerged, battalions and kingdoms would implement hasty damage controls to slow down the Antichrist, setting up quarantine zones to hopefully treat the victims of the plague. Yeah, this was only for the rich though. Poor people would get locked up in a cellar. But this newfound attention directed to the Blight would stop kingdoms in their tracks. This war was no longer about status or power or money. It was about survival. In this new war, the world learned how to be human. In San Sebastian, British prisoners would be released by the French guarding the fortress to help fight against the greater evil infecting the nearby town, temporarily casting their political differences aside to fight for survival. In the German city of Calm, Bavarian and Austrian soldiers would gather supplies and secure the castle that sits on the lake. Not to secure a powerful combat position, I tell you, but to create a safe house for refugees. I think. I hope. it would only make sense. Some of the examples of the indomitable human spirits taking over at times of great tribulation. And this may have been what God foresaw when the Blight came into existence. Ending wars that start over sinful disputes. But it's not all hoity-toity and perfect. Some kingdoms would still sin, such as the French soldiers in Roscoff torturing, beating and locking up the British in a church and leaving them to die. The very house of God. The French soldiers then had the wits to run away from the church, and majority would even be killed off by the infected, with the survivors being the third respawn point in the Roscoff storyline. And what about in Denmark, where Britain would bombard the city in order to purge the plague at the cost of the citizens who live there? Sin may still exist, but the kingdoms and battalions who sin will get purged at the end. The Blight can be spread through many different means. The most common method of spreading is the virus infecting the bloodstream through contact with infected saliva, obviously biting its way through the skin. There are also some instances of infection spreading through the rot from corpses. An example being in the Endless map, La Film d'un Hold, a last stand map in which role plays the last moments of a French and Prussian garrison at Ligny, with their forces being reduced to 20 men. Messages on the map are found saying, "Brûlez-le-moi," which translates from French as "burn the corpses." Thanks to this, we may speculate that the virus can transmit through being around corpses. But burning bodies is just a strategy to minimize having to handle the corpses, as handling corpses maximizes contact with bodily fluids from necrosis occurring on the body. Oh, right. We can't also forget the risk of the handled corpse suddenly rising from the dead. A common symptom of the Blight virus? Yeah, it's important to clean up infected bodies and dispose of them properly, because if they would decompose in the open, it could infect the soil and maybe taint a nearby water source, which could have been originally the major cause of transmission for the Blight plague. In the 1800s, diseases such as cholera were commonplace because people would drink from rivers that other people both crapped and died in. And assuming that, according to lore, majority of towns were diseased because the infection came from tainted food supplies, it indicates that the disease can also transmit through livestock and plants. But the resurrective properties would not assault animals, for they're stupid, which apparently makes them free of sin. Which can also explain why you don't see infected animals in the main campaign. Yeah, aside from the Headless Horseman's horse. But you know how some horses are giant dicks for no reason? Yeah, I think this may be one of those horses. Not everyone transforms the same from the virus, with some bodies reacting more differently to the disease because they have either a different psychology or a weaker immune system due to famine, because 1800s. But the average victim of the Blight is the Shambler. The Shambler would obviously be a victim who suffered from the Blight in the normal way, succumbing to the disease, dying from a lack of faith in God, and also total organ failure. We cannot forget total organ failure. The Shambler lacks all brain function. Their only purpose is to grab and bite. Their bodies, damaged from the Blight's attempts to convert them to the Antichrist, makes them sluggish and weak, indicating that the disease struggles with controlling their nervous system. This, however, does not cause their muscles to be weak, as they exert all of their force into their muscles to grab their prey, quoted by the British as having the strength of a sailor. Is the disease overloading nervous signals into the muscle, causing excessive strength at the expense of long-term muscle health, which matters not, as a cannibal is a mere marionette to manifest itself onto. Zombies! Ooga booga! In some rare cases, the Blight can put up with very little resistance from the victim. After all, it seems like the disease spreads best when it's entered the bloodstream, which lets the Blight spread to where it wants to spread to in a way that's more efficient than traditional infection from a contaminated river. This might be the reason why some infected individuals who are transformed through a bite has much better motor functions in comparison to the average Shambler. Because in a bite infection scenario, the disease can quickly overload the victim's immune system and cause a total breakdown into a victim's psychology without the need to kill off the patient. In this case, the victim may become a runner, or if the transformation was recent, They become a viral runner. The Blight has seized their motor functions flawlessly, allowing it to spread the Antichrist much easier through running and tackling the victim, with viral runners relentlessly puking on their victims too, as, like, to spread the disease as much as possible. Maybe it's a fetish, I don't know. But these are the most common methods of transformations for the undead. Greatly helping the disease transmit during the last stage of the outbreak, though. But bizarre anomalies and infection arise that does not transform the victim into a vector of the plague, but it instead transforms the victim into the most corrupt example of the victim's former psychology. It drives them batshit crazy with only a desire for violence. I said before that the Blight was considered God's wrath, and anyone who got infected would be overtaken by their own sins, right? But what if the victim does not believe in God? The bomber must have also been a bite victim, retaining brain function and their past memory thanks to avoiding brain death from... death, I guess. But instead of succumbing to the urge to bite, they instead succumb to their own sins to create as much mayhem as possible, carrying a gunpowder barrel to turn their body into a live bomb. It would be much easier to write in a zombie like the Left 4 Dead boomer who spreads infection through bile buildup, which is a very common phenomenon that happens when a corpse decomposes, but it may not abide by Roblox's rules. After all, they had to replace the cigar accessory with a carrot. Pyromania is a rare psychological disorder which causes the victim to be obsessed with fire and setting things on fire. If a pyromaniac would be bitten, they would succumb to their sins and enjoy an afterlife of lighting fires without punishment. Carrying the remnants of their expertise in arson, they remember how to throw lanterns at whatever fun flammable barricades they come across. Swordsmanship. A noble, prestigious art which requires decades of practice to master. Swordsmen spend hours upon hours practicing the same technique over and over again to burn the technique into their muscle memory, as it will give them an edge over combat, which is a stressful sport in which thinking and strategy does not belong, and only a flick of a well-memorized parry can determine who gets to live and die when dueling. Normally a former high-ranking swordsman from a cuirassier regiment, now a high-ranking Zord zombie from a cuirassier regiment. The cuirassier zombie retains their muscle memories from practicing the same parry for thousands of times, easily countering any sword they meet on their undead rampage, only being put to a permanent slumber from a bullet in their brain. You know how some people end up being like over 2 meters tall? Maybe it's because they drink a lot of milk. Maybe it's genetic. Yeah, that's the brute zombie. It's kind of like the regular shambler, but very big. Oh, no, right. We can't forget the zapper. The zapper. The zapper has an axe, I guess. Very interesting. The sins of wrath has overtaken the sapper from the regiment from a bite, and now he's transformed, okay, into the evil sapper, the zapper. Now this technically isn't canon to the lore, and I might ruin the excellent story of Guts Blackpowder by senselessly pandering to lore that doesn't exist. But it's very fun to talk about this because there's nothing I love more than plugging pieces of evidence together to form a theory for a story that doesn't exist. Just hear me out. Event bosses. The Dullahan, citing Irish mythology, is a headless demonic fairy often seen riding on horseback. The Dullahan is often cited to be the spirit of Crom-Dubh, ancient Celtic god that the Irish believed in before Catholic missionaries arrived. But in Guts and Blackpowder, the Headless Horseman comes from the 1820 book, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, written by Washington Irving. In the Gothic story, it features a character known as the Headless Horseman, believed to be a British soldier who was decapitated from a cannonball from the American War of Independence, where the Americans fought the British? What? But in this case, the Blight would have spread to America. Maybe due to the infected boarding party from the USS Constitution returning from Roscoe, and a few years later, the infection would have resurrected the so-called Headless Horseman, and maybe his horse. The fact that the horseman can live without a head while zombies can't? Who knows? Maybe the disease mutated once more once 1820 rolled along. The COVID virus mutated 3 times, if I can remember, and the Blight can resurrect corpses. There's not much question to it. Diseases are weird. And the reason why the horseman throws explosive pumpkins at Americans? Because he has the Halloween spirit, duh. And he also hates American people, duh. In the recent Halloween update, they added Dracula, as well as vampire shamblers. And this poses a bizarre challenge in my geeky pandering. Dracula was based on another ancient gothic horror novel called Dracula, because it's about Dracula. The book is oddly written like an analog horror, consisting entirely of letters and newspaper articles, mainly about people going to Transylvania and getting spooked by Dracula. And then Dracula's all over the place. Oh ho, do not come to my house or else I'll suck your dick. Given that the novel was published in 1897 and vampires are technically undead and like to eat people, yeah, I can assume that Guts Blackpowder's Dracula was a vampire cult leader, count, and part-time illusionist who took pride in terrorizing the locals in order to make mass profit. Maybe he ran a cult which believed that drinking blood would grant you immortality, and so he made a cult around it. But he was infected with the blight. But surprisingly, instead of succumbing to the disease, it cooperated with Dracula's borderline demonic personality to transform him into an actual vampire. His evil zombie powers? Magic. But here's the kicker with zombie diseases. Since the blight's main method of transmission is to reanimate corpses, these corpses would not be alive and therefore would succumb to rotting. After a few years, these zombies would cease to function. But with zombies and the tendency to overrun countries with their sheer numbers, a fresh supply of new zombies would be freshly transformed once they overrun a country. And it's necessary for zombies to constantly be on the move if the plague wants to cull every human on the planet. Because if a horde of zombies go victimless for a large period of time, they perish. So it's assumed that, like most plagues, after a few decades of zombie fighting, humans would both develop immunity to the disease, with survivor families with more favorable genetical traits developing immunity to the blight virus, managing to survive off of the contaminated food and water, whilst the zombies outside suffer from rotting, since their hosts are not meant to, quote, live this long. With most kingdoms being overrun and most governments being destabilized, survivor communities would form a new society on the ruins of the old. Or maybe the remnants of powerful kingdoms would conquer all of the ruined former kingdoms, and the Great War would re-engage. It would seem, though, at the end of the day, no tribulation nor rapture can ever change human behavior, for we all contain sin.